"You're the reason Dad left." He didn't shout it. He didn't even look angry when he said it. We were standing in the kitchen, late afternoon light, the kind that makes everything look softer than it is. My hand was still on the counter. I remember that clearly because I never moved it. For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. I waited for something else to come after it, a laugh, a clarification, anything that would turn it into a misunderstanding. But nothing came, just silence, thick, heavy, like the room itself had decided to stop breathing. I looked at his face, searching for something familiar. The child I raised, the boy's lunches I packed, the one I stayed up with during fevers. But what I saw wasn't anger or confusion. It was certainty. Someone else was there too. I won't say who yet, but they didn't interrupt him. They didn't correct him. They didn't even look surprised. That was when I realized this wasn't a new thought. This wasn't something he had just come up with. This was something he had been told. My chest tightened, not sharp, not dramatic, just a slow pressure, like air being taken out of the room. I wanted to ask 100 questions all at once. When did you start believing this? Who explained my marriage to you? When did I become the villain in my own child's life? But none of those questions made it to my mouth. I could already hear how it would sound if I spoke. Defensive, emotional, guilty, even if I wasn't. He crossed his arms, waiting, not for an answer, for confirmation, for me to finally admit something everyone else seemed to agree on. I felt small in a way I hadn't felt in years. Not weak, just suddenly outnumbered. Like the story of my life had been rewritten, and I'd missed the meeting where everyone agreed on the ending. I swallowed. I nodded once. That was it. No explanation, no correction, no reminder of the years before that sentence was even possible. His shoulders relaxed, just slightly, as if my silence proved something. And in that moment, standing in my own kitchen, being judged by my own child, I understood something I hadn't before. I wasn't being accused. I was being replaced, in the story, in the blame, in the truth. I didn't say anything. In that silence, that's where everything began to change. People like to imagine that single motherhood announces itself loudly, that there's a clear before and after. One day you're a family, the next day you're not. For me, it happened quietly. One less chair at the table, one side of the bed that stayed cold, fewer groceries bought, more hours worked. Life didn't fall apart, it just narrowed. I didn't sit my child down and explain why his father was gone. I didn't tell him what happens between two adults who stopped knowing how to talk to each other. I told him what I thought mattered, that he was loved, that he was safe, that some things weren't his to carry. So I carried them instead. I learned how to stretch money without calling it sacrifice. I learned which bills could wait a few days and which couldn't. I learned how to smile through parent-teacher meetings after working late, how to clap at school events with aching wrists, how to wake up before dawn and still sound cheerful when I said his name. There were years when I didn't buy anything for myself that wasn't necessary. Not as a statement, just because when you have to choose, you choose your child. Shoes before wants, school trips before rest, his growth before my comfort. When he asked about his father, I kept my voice steady. I never let frustration slip into my words. I never said the things I could have said. I answered simply, carefully, like handling glass. He loves you. He's doing his best. Some adults don't know how to stay. I didn't want him to grow up feeling torn in half. What I didn't realize, what no one warns you about, is that silence can be edited by other people. While I was working overtime, other conversations were happening. While I was making sure his world stayed stable, someone else was explaining it for me, simplifying it, softening one side, sharpening the other. I noticed small things first, a distance I couldn't name, questions that sounded rehearsed, a look he'd give me sometimes, like he was measuring something invisible. I told myself it was just age, just growing up. Children pull away, that's normal. I didn't notice how rarely anyone thanks me anymore, how my efforts were treated like background noise, always there, never acknowledged. I was dependable, and dependable people become invisible. No one asked how I managed. They assumed I did. No one asked what it cost. They assumed I could afford it. And I didn't complain. Not because I was strong, but because I believed that eventually it would be seen, that one day my child would understand without me needing to explain. I didn't know that by staying quiet, I was leaving space. Space for someone else to tell my story in a way that didn't include what I gave, only what they needed me to be. And by the time I felt this shift clearly enough to name it, the version of me he was learning to see had already been decided. I didn't find out all at once. No dramatic confession, no moment where someone sat me down and told me what was being said about me. It came in fragments, a sentence that stopped midway when I entered the room, a look exchanged between two people who didn't realize I was watching, a pause on the phone, too long to be nothing when my name came up. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. When you're tired, you start hearing things that aren't there. When you've been carrying everything alone for years, you get sensitive. That's what I told myself. Then one afternoon, I heard it clearly. "We all know why he left," someone said, not to me, about me. The way they said it, casual, settled, made my stomach drop. There was no anger in their voice, no hesitation, just certainty. Another voice answered, softer, almost sympathetic. "She was always difficult. He tried." I stood there, just outside the doorway, my hand on the wall. I remember thinking how strange it was that my body stayed upright while something inside me slowly folded in on itself. Difficult. That was the word now. Not tired, not overwhelmed, not doing her best, just difficult. No one mentioned the nights I slept sitting up because my child had a cough. No one mentioned the bills I paid alone. No one mentioned how long I stayed quiet, hoping things would improve. They talked like I wasn't real, like I was a concept they'd agreed on. Later, when I brought it up, carefully, calmly, I was met with looks of concern, not for what I'd heard, for me. "Oh, come on," someone said. "That's not what was meant. You're taking it too personally. We're just being honest." Honest, as if honesty only moved in one direction. I realized then that conversations had been happening without me for a long time. My absence from the room wasn't an accident. It was convenient. It made the story simpler. Even my child began to echo things I'd never said out loud. "You're always stressed," he told me once, like he was quoting someone. "Dad says you didn't let him breathe." I didn't ask when they talked. I didn't ask how often. I didn't ask what else had been said. Because some answers change how you see everyone. I sat with it instead. The betrayal wasn't loud. It didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It came dressed as concern, wrapped in reasonable tones, delivered by people who claimed to love me. And the worst part wasn't that they believed it was that they believed it together. I felt myself shrinking in rooms I used to feel safe in. I started choosing my words carefully, then more carefully, until sometimes I chose silence instead. I told myself it would pass, that truth had a way of resurfacing on its own. What I didn't understand yet was that once a story settles into people's minds, it doesn't leave just because it isn't true. It leaves only when something forces it to. After that, nothing was said directly, but everything was implied. I noticed how conversations shifted when I walked into the room. Voices softened, topics changed. People smiled too quickly, like they were managing something fragile, like I was fragile. If I disagreed with anything, even gently, it was noted. There you go again. You always make things tense. Why do you have to turn everything into an issue? I started hearing those words more often than my own thoughts. When I tried to explain how I felt, I was told I was overreacting. When I stayed quiet, I was told my silence made people uncomfortable. There was no correct version of me anymore, only a wrong one. Someone said, "You've always been like this," with a small, tired sigh, as if my entire life could be summed up as a personality flaw everyone else had learned to tolerate. I replayed moments in my head late at night, wondering where that version of me had come from. I looked for proof, for patterns, for something I had missed. All I found were ordinary moments. Me setting boundaries, asking questions, saying no when something felt wrong. Apparently, that was enough. My pain was minimized so smoothly, I almost missed it happening. Well, relationships are complicated. He had his reasons. You weren't perfect either. No one asked what it felt like to be left with everything. No one asked how I managed after he was gone. The focus stayed fixed on what I might have done to deserve it. Even my exhaustion became evidence. "See," someone said once, "you're always so negative." I learned quickly that defending myself only made it worse. Any attempt to clarify was labeled control. Any emotion was labeled instability. So I stopped reacting. I nodded. I listened. I absorbed it. Inside, something tightened. Not anger, something colder. A growing awareness that this wasn't about truth anymore. It was about comfort. And blaming me was easier than sitting with anything complicated. They spoke about my life like I wasn't in the room, like I was a problem they were patiently managing, and I let them think that. Because I could feel it building, the pressure, the expectation. They wanted me to break, to cry, to explode, to confirm the version of me they'd already decided on. I didn't give them that. I stayed quiet, calm, careful. And while they mistook my silence for guilt, I was starting to understand something they didn't realize yet. If I was going to be blamed no matter what I said, then what I said next would matter very differently. Once they realized I wasn't going to fall apart, they changed tactics. It started with suggestions, the kind that sound reasonable until you listen closely. Maybe it would be better if someone else handled the finances. You've had a lot on your plate. Don't you think you need help making decisions? We're just worried about the child. Worried. That word was used like a shield. Every overstep was wrapped in it, every intrusion justified by it. They questioned how I spent money I earned. They asked why I insisted on certain routines, certain rules. They spoke as if I were barely managing, even though nothing had fallen apart. Bills were paid, school was handled, life kept moving. But apparently stability wasn't enough. They wanted control. I started getting messages instead of calls, shorter, careful, written in a way that could be shown to someone else later. I noticed how often my responses were reread, reinterpreted, brought up again days later as proof of something vague and concerning. "You sound defensive. That tone isn't helping. This is exactly what we mean." No matter how neutral I was, it was never neutral enough. Then came the unspoken threats, the pauses after I said no, the reminders of who had influence, who had resources, who could step in if things got difficult. I was cornered without anyone ever raising their voice. I felt it in my body before I admitted it to myself, the way my shoulders stayed tight, the way I stopped sleeping deeply, the way my heart raced when my phone lit up with certain names. They expected me to crack, to beg, to finally admit fault just to make it stop. Instead, I became very still. I stopped explaining. I stopped defending. I answered only what was asked, and nothing more. I watched carefully. I started remembering dates, words, patterns. I realized something important then. This wasn't about my child's well-being anymore. It was about control over the story, about making sure the version of events that favored them stayed intact, and I was standing in the way of that. One afternoon, a request was made, calmly, politely, that crossed a line I hadn't even known was still mine to draw. It was presented as cooperation, as compromise, but I could see it for what it was. If I agreed, I would disappear from my own life in small, permanent ways. I looked at the message for a long time before responding. I felt the familiar pressure to keep the peace, to give in, to make things easier for everyone else. Then, quietly, something inside me settled. I typed a short reply. No. I didn't explain it. I didn't soften it. And in that moment, I knew they weren't prepared for me to stop yielding. Saying no didn't fix anything. It didn't calm the tension or make people step back. If anything, it made the air feel thinner. But it changed something in me. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting to be understood. I wasn't rehearsing explanations in my head or choosing my words based on how they might be twisted later. I let the silence sit where my apologies used to be. I started noticing things I'd ignored before. How often conversations happened without witnesses. How memories shifted depending on who was telling them. How concern always seemed to arrive with conditions attached. So I made a quiet decision. I didn't announce it. I didn't warn anyone. I just stopped moving blindly. I began keeping records, not obsessively, not out of fear, but because clarity had become necessary. Messages saved, dates written down, small details noted, the kind people forget when they assume no one is paying attention. I asked questions I'd avoided before, neutral ones, practical ones, the kind that don't invite emotion, only answers. And I listened closely, not just to what was said, but to what wasn't. At home, I changed very little. The routine stayed the same, meals were made, homework was checked, life continued, outwardly untouched. But inside, I was no longer bracing for impact. I stopped filling in gaps for other people. If someone misunderstood me, I let the misunderstanding sit. I didn't rush to fix it. I wanted to see how far it would go without my help. It went further than I expected. That told me everything. There was no moment of triumph, no sense of power, just a steady, grounded feeling that I hadn't felt in years, like standing on solid ground after balancing on something unstable for too long. I knew there were risks. I knew this wouldn't end quietly. People who benefit from your silence don't like it when you stop providing it. But I also knew something else. Whatever was coming next, I would meet it prepared. Not with anger, not with explanations, with facts, with boundaries, with a calm they couldn't provoke. I didn't know how the truth would surface or who would be there when it did. I only knew that when it happened, I wouldn't be scrambling to catch up anymore. And that changed the direction of everything that followed. The truth didn't come out the way I imagined it would. There was no dramatic confrontation, no moment where I stood up and said everything I'd been holding back, no speech that left the room stunned into silence. It came out quietly, almost accidentally. We were all in the same place, finally, sitting across from each other, close enough that I could hear the rhythm of everyone's breathing. Papers on the table, neutral faces, a setting that made emotions feel out of place. I said very little. I didn't need to. Questions were asked, simple ones, dates, numbers, decisions, the kind of questions that don't care about feelings, only consistency. At first, the answers came easily, confident, familiar. I recognized the tone immediately. It was the same story I'd been hearing for years, just told with more polish. Then something small happened. A detail didn't line up. It wasn't obvious, just a pause, a glance downward, someone correcting themselves mid-sentence. I felt it before anyone said anything. The shift, the way certainty thinned when it was asked to stand on its own. Another question followed, then another. I watched people realize slowly that I hadn't reacted, interrupted, or argued because I hadn't needed to. Everything I'd stayed silent about was sitting there already, waiting. Messages were read out loud, dates spoken carefully, decisions traced back to their origin. No commentary from me, no emotion added, just facts. The room grew quieter with each one. I noticed how people stopped looking at me and started looking at each other, how the confidence drained from voices that had once spoken so freely about my failures. Someone cleared their throat, someone else shifted in their chair. For the first time, the story didn't belong to them. I stayed calm, not because I was trying to prove anything, but because there was nothing left to prove. I wasn't fighting for my version anymore. I was watching theirs fall apart on its own. Then my child spoke. Not dramatically, not angrily, just honestly. A small sentence, a question really, one that had clearly been forming for a while. And in that moment, I saw it. The confusion, the recalculation, the quiet realization that what he'd been told didn't fully match what he was hearing now. No one rushed to explain it away this time. No one spoke for me. They didn't need to. The truth had finally made it into the room, and once it was there, it didn't raise its voice. It didn't have to. After that day, things didn't magically soften. People like to believe truth fixes everything, that once it's out in the open, relationships heal themselves, apologies arrive neatly, and balance is restored. That isn't how it happened. What changed was quieter than that. Some conversations stopped altogether. Messages that used to come regularly slowed, then disappeared. Invitations became polite instead of warm. I noticed how carefully certain people chose their words now, how they avoided my eyes when we were in the same room. No one said I was wrong. No one said, I'm sorry. They didn't need to. The shift was enough. At home, the air felt different, not lighter, just more honest. My child didn't suddenly become affectionate or remorseful. There was no tearful apology, no moment where he admitted everything he'd believed had been wrong. What there was hesitation, questions asked more slowly, statements phrased less confidently, a space where certainty used to be. Sometimes he'd look at me like he was seeing me for the first time, not as a problem to be managed, not as the reason something broke, just as a person who had been there all along. We started small, practical conversations, neutral ground. I didn't rush him. I didn't fill the silence with explanations he hadn't asked for. I had learned that lesson already. I wasn't interested in being forgiven for something I hadn't done. I wasn't chasing validation anymore. I just wanted the truth to have room to breathe. Some relationships stayed distant, others adjusted, A few never returned to what they were, and I accepted that without fighting it. Not everything that ends needs to be repaired. What mattered was this: I stopped shrinking. I didn't soften my boundaries to make people comfortable. I didn't rush to smooth over tension that wasn't mine to carry. I let things be as they were, even when that meant sitting with discomfort, especially then. I learned that dignity doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It just stays, steady, quiet, unmovable, long after noise has burned itself out. And if any part of this story feels familiar, if you've ever been blamed quietly, rewritten slowly, or judged without being asked, you're not alone. You don't have to explain yourself tonight. You don't have to correct the story all at once. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay calm, stay present, and let the truth arrive on its own time. If this story stayed with you, feel free to share your thoughts below. And if you want to hear more stories like this, quiet, real, and unresolved in honest ways, you know where to find them.